What happens when the line between justice and personal history blurs inside a courtroom? Judge Eleanor Hayes, known for her unwavering impartiality, faces her greatest test when the next defendant is James Anderson, a man accused of assault and robbery, but also the childhood friend she never forgot. How do you stay objective when the person on trial once shared your deepest secrets and summer dreams? As Eleanor weighs the fragile threads of evidence against a flood of personal memories, she's forced to confront the haunting question: can justice truly be blind when the past refuses to let go? In a world where verdicts shape futures, will she uphold the law or protect the boy she once called her best friend? Before we continue this story, let us know where you are watching from. If you like stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another special story for you. Judge Eleanor Hayes entered courtroom, feeling the usual brisk energy of a weekday docket. Lawyers in dark suits shuffled about, exchanging last-minute whispers with their clients. The court reporter tested her machine, tapping out random keys as a warm-up. Spectators settled onto polished wooden benches, some out of curiosity and others to show support or glean fresh gossip. Overhead, fluorescent lights hummed softly, lending a harsh clarity to every corner of the room. Yet to Eleanor, this day seemed no different from the countless ones she had presided over before. As she settled behind the tall oak bench, she glanced at a stack of folders the clerk had placed there. Each file told a piece of someone's life: a criminal charge, a civil dispute, a story of conflict that ended up in her jurisdiction. She'd seen so many over the years: theft, assault, drug possession, DUIs, and a host of complicated suits that blurred the line between guilt and redemption. At times, she wondered if the system she served actually led people toward a better future, or if it simply churned them through an endless loop. The bailiff, a tall woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, announced the day's next case with typical formality: the state of Louisiana versus James Anderson. Eleanor reached for the file labeled Anderson, J. The charges were grim: assault and robbery, resisting arrest. Standard enough from the outside. She drew a short breath. She would have to maintain her impartiality, as always. When the defense door swung open and the defendant stepped into view, Eleanor found her gaze landing on a figure in handcuffs, shoulders slightly slumped, head bowed as if weighed down by resignation. Even from a distance, something about him tugged at her memory. A detail in his posture, the tilt of his chin, or the shape of his forehead. She felt a surge of déjà vu. Then he raised his eyes, scanning the courtroom almost reflexively. In that instant, Eleanor felt her chest tighten. This was James. Her James. She steadied herself, pressing her lips together. On the record, James Anderson was an accused robber. Off the record, he was the boy she had once known, the same boy who had been her best friend during those sticky Louisiana summers decades ago. But the man before her showed little resemblance to the lively child who raced her on bicycles or challenged her to climb the tallest magnolia tree behind her mother's house. His face was worn, etched by years that must have been cruel. "Mr. Anderson, you stand accused of assault, robbery, and resisting arrest," she said, her voice echoing through the microphone. "How do you plead?" The official question. The opening line. She said it with a judge's practiced detachment, though her heart thudded so loudly she was sure someone in the gallery could hear. "Not guilty, Your Honor," James replied. His voice was raspy, almost hoarse, lacking the boyish enthusiasm she remembered. A distant flicker passed between them, a silent recognition. But then he dropped his gaze, as though refusing to let that spark linger in a place so defined by procedure and consequence. Eleanor's mind spun. She'd known that, in a career spanning decades, she might someday cross paths with someone from her childhood. Yet she had never prepared for this possibility. Here he was, charged with violent crimes, facing the very system she had pledged to uphold. The law demanded she approach his case with neutrality. Her oath as a judge bound her to fairness above all else. She glanced at the assembled attorneys. The prosecutor, a veteran named Richard Powell, flipped through his notes, lips set in a thin line. Lisa Porter, James's defense counsel, stood at her table, face composed, but shoulders visibly tense. They had no idea that the judge on this bench had once skipped rocks in a creek with the defendant. "Counsel will proceed with opening statements," Eleanor said, leaning forward to ensure her voice carried. "Prosecution first." She hoped her tone came across as calm rather than shaken. Inside, she felt a tempest of memory and disbelief. The prosecutor began reciting the state's argument, painting a picture of the alleged crime. James had allegedly assaulted a store clerk before robbing a convenience store, leaving the victim injured and traumatized. Eleanor tried to focus on every word, but flashes of the past kept intruding. She imagined James as a young teen, all bright eyes and big dreams, once telling her about how he planned to leave their small town behind. How had he ended up here? When the prosecution paused, Lisa Porter stepped up to give her opening, insisting that James Anderson was innocent and that the evidence would not withstand proper scrutiny. Eleanor forced herself to remain outwardly poised. This was her duty, to set aside any personal involvement and judge based on facts. But as she hammered the gavel to signal a brief recess, she could not ignore the swirl of emotions that threatened her composure. Outside the presence of the jury, she rose from the bench, ignoring the lines of curious eyes in the gallery. Her heart felt heavy. This was not just another case. And at that moment, she realized that staying impartial might be the hardest challenge she had ever faced in her legal career. Eleanor retreated to her chambers, attempting to steady her breath. She could practically feel her pulse thrumming in her temples. The room, usually her sanctuary, felt too small. Its shelves were filled with law books and binders, and the walls bore framed certificates that testified to her accomplishments. Yet the comforting gravitas of her office could do little to ease the sudden onslaught of memories. Slumping into her leather chair, she recalled the first time she had met James Anderson. They were just kids, maybe 8 or 9, growing up in Hammond, a town that straddled the line between rural charm and urban sprawl. She was the daughter of a local teacher, living in a small but well-kept house. James's family lived in a modest bungalow near the railroad tracks. One sweltering summer afternoon, they met by sheer chance along a creek where kids often went to cool off. She'd seen James struggling to free a snagged fishing line. Without hesitation, she hopped over the rocks and offered to help, surprising both him and herself. From that day forward, they built a bond. She was drawn to James's playful spirit and earnest way of speaking. They'd spend hours exploring the edges of town, chasing each other through fields, inventing grand stories about hidden treasures and imaginary foes. Even then, she sensed a fierce determination in James, a drive to carve out a future beyond the worn fences and stoic traditions that penned them in. Over time, though, their families' differing views and social pressures took a toll. Whispers traveled through the neighborhood whenever they were seen together. Relatives warned them to stay with your own. Coded words for social lines that were not meant to be crossed. In high school, their closeness strained. Eleanor's father disapproved of the friendship, while James faced a different kind of disapproval from people in his own circle who believed a friendship with her was doomed or disloyal. Eventually, events and adult intervention pried them apart. James's family moved, and the teenage versions of them never reconnected. As those memories flooded her, Eleanor pressed her hands flat against the desk. The cynic in her whispered that James's situation was a logical outcome for a boy who had too few resources and too many obstacles. Yet another part of her wanted to believe that the bright-eyed child she knew could never commit the crime at issue. She glanced at a photograph on her desk, herself at a law school graduation, father beaming at her side. She dedicated her life to justice, to the principle that the law was a tool to protect the innocent and hold the guilty accountable. Now that principle stood on shaky ground. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Her court clerk, Margaret, entered with a cautious smile. "Judge Hayes, we're set to reconvene soon. Is there anything you need?" Margaret had been her clerk for 3 years. She was sharp discreet, and unwaveringly professional. "No, just give me a minute," Eleanor replied, especially when they intersected with their courtroom. But Margaret's wise gaze and gentle kindness drew a partial truth from Eleanor. "I happen to know the defendant," Eleanor confessed, choosing her words carefully. "From a long time ago. I wasn't aware until he appeared in front of me." Margaret's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. "I see. Should I inform someone? Is there a conflict of interest that requires recusal?" Eleanor shook her head. "He's an old friend, but we lost contact years ago. There's no financial or familial tie, nothing that would automatically disqualify me from presiding. I needed to say it out loud." She paused, swallowing. "I can remain fair. I just need to keep my emotions in check. Let me know." "Thank you," Eleanor said quietly. Margaret left, closing the door behind her. Gathering her composure, Eleanor stood, adjusted her robe, and straightened the stack of files. She could not neglect her duties as a judge. Personal feelings aside, she owed it to both the accused and the public to handle the case with all the objectivity she could muster. Moments later, she walked back into the courtroom. The bench felt simultaneously welcoming and crushing under the weight of her conflicting emotions. She noted that James avoided eye contact, his expression carefully blank, as if shutting out any sign of familiarity. Perhaps he was doing what she was doing, try to remain stoic, adhering to the roles they'd each been cast in. The prosecution resumed with witness testimony. A store clerk recounted a scuffle and partial identification of the assailant as a man wearing a dark hoodie. The clerk insisted it was James, though he admitted that lighting in the store was poor. The defense challenged him, pointing out inconsistencies in his recollection of the suspect's clothing color. As they debated, Eleanor found herself scrutinizing every detail, every nuance, knowing James's fate might hinge on these fragments. When the recess came, she huddled over her notes. Legally, everything was standard: a mild case of questionable evidence, a plausible argument about mistaken identity. But personally, her mind reeled. She wondered what James had been through since they last spoke, and how each turn might have led him to stand here as a defendant. She recalled the images of them as children, carefree in the muddy creek, forging a bond that once seemed unbreakable. And as the court proceedings continued, she realized that no matter how she tried, she could not banish that boyhood friend from her thoughts. The trial entered its second day with a sharper tension in the air. Prosecutor Richard Powell arrived in a crisp navy suit, jaw set in a posture of unwavering resolve. Defense attorney Lisa Porter, younger but equally determined, flipped through her legal pad, occasionally glancing at James to gauge his demeanor. By this point, the gallery had thinned to those genuinely invested in the outcome. Local reporters, a few curious onlookers, and a smattering of family members and friends. Judge Hayes, robed in solemn black, called the court to order. Gavel strikes echoed off the walls like distant thunder, and the bailiff recited her standard instructions. Eleanor discreetly scanned the room. She saw James at the defense table, his posture rigid, though his eyes darted around with subdued anxiety. Whenever she looked at him, she felt that familiar pang. Was this the same kid who once teased her for screaming at the sight of a frog? Richard Powell called his primary eyewitness to the stand. It was the convenience store's night manager, a middle-aged man named Victor Chambers. Chambers explained that on the evening in question, he noticed a suspicious figure loitering in an aisle near the back of the store. According to Chambers, the figure wore a hoodie and muttered something before rushing the clerk, demanding money from the register. Chambers insisted he saw the suspect's face in a passing glance, and it matched James Anderson's. "How certain are you that it was the defendant?" Powell asked, voice laden with conviction. Chambers straightened in the witness chair. "I'd say pretty certain, around 70 or 80% sure." A faint murmur rose from spectators. While 70 or 80% wasn't absolute certainty, it hinted at some level of recognition. Lisa Porter's cross-examination was blunt. "Mr. Chambers, you stated in earlier testimony you only caught a partial glimpse. Do you acknowledge that the store's lighting is dimmer than ideal, especially near the corners. He shifted uncomfortably. Yes, it can be dim. So, with dim lighting and a partial glimpse, how can you be so confident you identified Mr. Anderson correctly? Chambers hesitated, because after all the commotion, I saw him run out. And the man we found outside later looked just like the one from inside. He shook his head. It all happened quickly. But I know what I saw. Lisa nodded, letting a moment of silence linger. No further questions, she said, stepping back. Eleanor sensed the undercurrent of doubt the defense was trying to cultivate. Relying on a partial ID in poor lighting was questionable. But was it enough to overshadow the entire case? Next, the prosecution introduced physical evidence. A wad of cash found on James at the time of arrest, allegedly matching the approximate amount taken from the register. The store's receipts suggested that exact sum had gone missing. Yet the defense argued the cash was not exclusively traceable to the store. No distinct markings, no specialized receipts. They contended that James might well have had that money for personal reasons, though they had yet to show how or why. Not personal histories. Still, her mind wandered back to the day James taught her to skip stones across the creek. How his laugh burst out each time a stone bounced more than 2 or 3 times. Could that same person really have battered a clerk and stolen money? During a midday break, she encountered Lisa Porter in the hallway. Lisa, balancing a binder in one arm, paused. "Judge Hayes," she said politely, "we'll be calling Officer Harris next, the arresting officer." Eleanor gave a curt nod, realizing Lisa must be gauging her reaction or searching for any sign of partiality. "Understood, Ms. Porter. We'll proceed when court reconvenes." She forced a professional tone, mindful of the tightrope she was walking. After lunch, Officer Daniel Harris took the stand, a tall man with a uniform that seemed too tight around his broad shoulders. His testimony was methodical. He'd received a call about a robbery suspect fleeing on foot, spotted James 2 blocks away, and detained him. The officer insisted that James matched the suspect's description perfectly. But Lisa Porter's cross-examination chipped away at his certainty. "You wrote in your report that the suspect wore a red hoodie," she pointed out. "Yet my client was found in a black jacket. Did you recover a red hoodie anywhere near the arrest site?" Harris bristled. "No, but he could have discarded it before we arrived." "It happens." Lisa nodded. "Sure, it's possible. Did you organize a thorough search of the route? Garbage bins? Alleyways?" He hesitated. "We did a cursory look, but nothing turned up. We had reason to believe we already had our man." "You assumed guilt," Lisa said, letting the words hang. No further questions. Her strategy was clear, to portray law enforcement as having jumped to a conclusion, ignoring contradictory details. When court adjourned, tension felt thick enough to slice with a knife. Eleanor called for the bailiff to clear the gallery, reminding everyone to return the next morning for more testimony. She watched James being let out in handcuffs. Though worn and weary, he seemed to carry a subtle flicker of hope after hearing the defense poke holes in the state's case. Eleanor stayed on the bench for a moment, alone, the echo of footsteps fading from the corridor. She stared at the empty defendant's table and felt a surge of conflicting emotions. She recalled the dreams they once shared, how James wanted to travel, to see places that didn't judge him before he spoke, and how she yearned to study law and fight injustice. She'd managed to achieve her ambition, yet ironically found herself face-to-face with a friend who had perhaps believed in fairness even more. With a heavy sigh, she gathered her files and retreated to her chambers. The day's proceedings underscored how precarious truth could be, balancing on the edges of partial identifications and muddled recollections. She couldn't let her personal connection blind her, but neither could she ignore the possibility that James was innocent, trapped in a case built on shaky assumptions. Tomorrow, the final testimonies would shape the trial's trajectory, and she would have to see it through with unwavering integrity, even if it tore her apart inside. When Eleanor stepped into the courtroom the following morning, a murmur spread through those present. This was scheduled as the trial's final day of testimony and argument, people could sense the crescendo. The prosecuting team seemed especially eager to seal their case, while the defense aimed to deliver a decisive counterpunch. Through it all, Judge Hayes maintained a dignified calm that masked her inner turmoil. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. Gavel in hand, Eleanor nodded for the proceedings to continue. The prosecutor, Richard Powell, wasted no time. He called a forensic expert who asserted that small fibers found on James's jacket loosely matched those from the crime scene. On direct examination, the expert concluded these fibers were consistent with the store environment. But on cross, Lisa Porter highlighted that the store was a generic environment that many people might pass through daily. "Isn't it true, sir," she asked, "that these fiber matches could come from clothing sold by various brands nationwide, and that we cannot definitively place Mr. Anderson inside the store based on that alone?" The expert conceded the point, admitting that while the fibers raised suspicion, they provided no absolute confirmation. The tension in the jury box rose. Confusion was written on several faces. After a brief recess, Lisa Porter called James to the stand. He had hesitated at first, aware that taking the stand could expose him to harsh cross-examination, but ultimately decided it was worth it. The hush that fell over the courtroom was profound as James adjusted the microphone and took his oath. "Mr. Anderson," Lisa began softly, "in your own words, tell us about your whereabouts the night of the incident." James licked his lips, glancing around as if uncertain he was allowed to speak freely. "I was leaving my friend's place. His name is Devin. We were just hanging out, talking about a job lead he had. I left around 9. I was walking home when an officer pulled up, lights flashing. Next thing I know, I'm in cuffs." Lisa nodded. "The prosecution asserts you were carrying stolen cash. Can you explain why you had money on you?" "I just gotten paid under the table for helping fix up a neighbor's roof," James answered. "I don't have a bank account right now, so I was carrying it in my pocket." He shrugged. "I guess it looked suspicious, but it wasn't stolen." She stepped aside, letting him talk uninterrupted. His testimony was raw, straightforward. He admitted his life hadn't been easy. He'd had minor scrapes with the law before, trespassing, loitering. But he insisted he'd never resorted to violence and never stolen from anyone. Throughout his speech, he cast only one fleeting glance in Eleanor's direction. She had to force herself not to react, though his voice wobbled slightly on mention of how quickly the cops decided he was their guy. Powell's cross-examination was firm. "Mr. Anderson, you claim you were walking home, but you refused to produce a witness, Devin, for instance. Where is he?" James tensed. "He's scared. He's got a record, too, and doesn't trust the system. He didn't want to get involved." "But you expect this court to take your word on faith?" Powell asked, eyebrows arched. James paused, biting his lip. "I expect you to consider the possibility I'm telling the truth. Not everything is neat and tidy, but that doesn't make me a robber." Powell let that hang, turning to the jury with a dubious glare, then said, "No further questions." James left the stand with shoulders slumped. When the parties rested, Eleanor gave the jury their final instructions. She outlined the presumption of innocence, the burden of proof, and how they must rely on the evidence alone. Inside, she fought the urge to inject her personal knowledge of James. She had no proof that, as children, he'd been kind and idealistic, nor did that necessarily mean he couldn't have changed. But she longed for the jury to see him as more than a caricature on a rap sheet. That conflict tore at her, but she steeled herself. Her oath demanded neutrality. Closing arguments came next. Powell hammered home the matching sum of money and the partial witness identification. Lisa Porter underscored the shaky nature of the ID, the lack of a red hoodie recovered, the questionable fiber evidence, and the real possibility that bias might have guided law enforcement. The jury left to deliberate. The clock ticked, the crowd whispered, and James perched in a corner, hands clenched. Eleanor retreated to her chambers briefly, though she could barely concentrate. She replayed images of him, youthful and full of dreams, and compared it to the exhausted, middle-aged man out there. She wished this final outcome wasn't in the hands of people who'd known him for mere days, But that was how the system worked. After an eternity, the bailiff signaled that the jury had reached a verdict. Eleanor returned to the bench, her heart hammering in her chest. She surveyed the packed courtroom, every seat filled with anticipation. James stood with Lisa at his side, both looking braced for impact. The foreperson of the jury passed a slip of paper to the clerk, who handed it to Eleanor. Her eyes flicked over the words. She inhaled deeply. This was it. Members of the jury, you have found the defendant, James Anderson. She paused, voice catching ever so slightly. Not guilty on all charges. In that moment, a surge of emotion swelled through the room. Some breathed sighs of relief. Others muttered in frustration. But the verdict was clear. James let out a shaky exhale, shoulders trembling as if a huge weight dropped from them. Eleanor tapped her gavel to restore quiet. Court is adjourned. With those words, she closed one chapter of a story that had begun decades ago by a creek under a sticky Louisiana sun. And yet, she suspected the real reckoning for them both was just beginning. The courtroom began to empty, benches creaking as the audience dispersed. Reporters scrambled outside, keen to break news of the surprising not guilty verdict in a seemingly straightforward robbery case. In the aisles, a few supporters of James patted him on the back, giving him hushed congratulations. But for the most part, relief felt muted, laced with exhaustion from the tense proceedings. Eleanor remained on the bench, finalizing notes and instructions for her clerk. Her gaze floated over to James, who now stood near the defense table. Though free of handcuffs, he still wore the look of a man braced for more disappointment. The swirling sense that they were strangers again tugged at her heart. She had to remind herself, he was no longer the boy who shared secrets about stargazing and building a better life. He was now a grown man who had faced the harshness of a world that sometimes saw him as less than. Gradually, the room cleared until only a few staff members remained. James hovered by the exit, as if unsure whether to walk away or approach. In a quiet gesture, Lisa Porter patted his arm and left, presumably giving him space to decide how to handle this unexpected reunion. Eleanor closed a folder, exhaled, and descended from the bench. Dignified steps carried her to the front of the courtroom, her black robe swishing around her ankles. Up close, James looked worn, the faint lines of stress etched around his eyes and mouth. She could almost see the ghosts of their childhood in his features, remnants of the laughter they once shared. He spoke first, voice husky with unspoken emotion. Judge Hayes. The formality in his greeting stung her a bit. She was Eleanor to him before, once, long ago. She nodded. James, she replied softly. Then, acknowledging the tension, she continued. You're free now. The jury found you not guilty, and that's what matters. He huffed a short, humorless laugh. Is it that simple? He shook his head. I've been in and out of trouble for so long. Some of it my fault, some of it not. Walking out of here today doesn't mean the world sees me any different. Eleanor felt a pang. She recalled how fiercely James had once insisted they break the cycle, flee a hometown that pinned them into predictable roles. I'm sorry, she whispered, though she wasn't entirely sure for what. Maybe for letting their friendship slip away, or maybe because the system they both lived under never gave him an equal shot. James's eyes flickered with subdued anger. You're sorry. You and I both had big dreams, remember? You wanted to become a lawyer, a judge, fix the wrongs of the world. Me, I wanted to get out of Hammond, see new places. But look at us. You're wearing the robe, living that success, and I'm 1 foot out of the cell. It's not exactly how we pictured it, huh? She swallowed hard, lips parting in an effort to find the right words. I did what I thought was best. I pursued law to help people, but the road changed me. And you, I never knew where you ended up. He cast a glance at the corridor. After my family moved, things got rough. I got by doing odd jobs. Slipped up, hung with the wrong crowd at times. I can't say I'm innocent of every mistake, but I never hurt anyone the way they said I did. He paused, inhaling a slow breath. If you're looking for answers about how I got here, that's it, a lifetime of scraping by, being judged for how I look. No big story, just survival. Eleanor's chest tightened. She didn't want to sound condescending, but she also couldn't remain silent. If there's anything I can do, he cut her off gently, raising a hand. I'm not here for favors. I appreciate that you had to keep your distance, keep it professional. But in that distance, I realized something. This system, it's not built for me. Today I got a lucky break because Lisa proved the evidence was shaky. Next time, I might not be so lucky. She lowered her gaze, feeling the sting of truth in his words. The system can fail people, she admitted. I see it every day. Yet, part of me still hopes there's room to do better. He watched her for a long moment, as if weighing whether the young girl who once believed in the power of fairness was still in there. Then, quietly, he said, I hope you're right. They stood in silence, the hush broken only by a distant shuffle of footsteps in the hallway. Eventually, James gave a nod. He looked about to say something else, maybe thanks, maybe goodbye, but no words came. Instead, he simply turned toward the door, steps purposeful yet cautious. Eleanor stood rooted, that wave of emotion returning. She wanted to call out to him, to rekindle the closeness they'd lost. But the boundaries were too deep, the years too far gone. So she watched him slip through the exit, leaving behind an aftertaste of memories she couldn't fully contain. Walking back to gather her notes, she realized that part of her life had come full circle in this room. He was free, but the struggles he faced and the ones she felt within herself remained unresolved. In the end, the verdict might have saved him from prison, but it also served as a stark reminder of how precarious justice can be for those who exist on society's margins. Judge Eleanor Hayes left the courthouse that evening with a heavier heart than when she arrived. The day's events had gone beyond a single verdict. They had forced her to confront the reality that justice is far more complicated than any statute or procedure can capture. She had presided over James Anderson's trial as impartially as possible, despite her personal memories and deep-seated guilt. He was found not guilty. Yet their encounter under such circumstances underscored the painful distance between them, between the life she led in robes and the life he struggled to navigate. In reflecting on her past, Eleanor recognized how swiftly childhood bonds could unravel under social pressures and diverging life paths. She had achieved her ambition, ascending to a powerful role meant to safeguard fairness. But here was James, a living testament to the shortcomings of a system that often labels people before understanding them. For all her authority, she still felt powerless to rectify what years of inequality had done to him. In the aftermath, she vowed to strive harder for genuine fairness, not just procedural compliance. She could no longer offer the friendship they once had, but she could use her position to ensure that future defendants, no matter their background, found a judge who looked beyond the surface. She might not save everyone from an unfair fate, but perhaps she could help steer the system in a more humane direction, one verdict at a time. And in that choice, she hoped to honor the childhood promises she and James once made beneath the Louisiana sun.